It began in the early hours of the day, at approximately 3:30 a.m. Gabon's local time. The Gabonese Electoral Commission announced on national television that incumbent President Ali Bongo had won re-election.
The Election Commission announcing there that the incumbent president Ali Bongo had been re-elected as president of Gabon.
Shortly after, a group of senior military officers appeared on the same state television channel to declare they had seized power in a pre-dawn military coup. Gunfire was heard in the capital Libreville shortly after the results were announced. Zooming into that, the events happened all too quickly. President Ali Bongo is immediately placed under house arrest. The election held just days ago is annulled. The government is dissolved in less than 60 seconds. A political dynasty that had ruled Gabon more than half a century collapses. Well, or so we thought. Yeah, it turns out this coup was all a family affair, removing one Bongo for another. But what happens next is the paradox that defines modern Africa. The streets of Libreville don't erupt in horror, they erupt in celebration. Crowds gather, cheering the soldiers. Young men wave flags, women dance, the scenes are jubilant, almost carnival-like. This is not what the downfall of democracy is supposed to look like. But here's what makes Gabon truly significant. It's not an isolated incident. Since 2020, 8 successful military coups have swept across Africa: Mali, Guinea, Chad, Burkina Faso twice in 1 year, then Niger, Sudan, and more recently, Guinea-Bissau. A belt of military takeovers stretches from the Atlantic Ocean across the Sahel, consuming country after country. Each time, the pattern repeats. Soldiers seize power, citizens pour into the streets, not to protest but to celebrate. The data reveals the scale of democratic collapse. Only 7% of Africans now live in countries rated free by global democracy monitors. Half of Africa's 1.4 billion people live under regimes classified as not free. By 2024, the continent's overall democracy levels had fallen back to where they stood in the year 2000. 2 decades of supposed progress completely erased. And yet, surveys show that 2/3 of Africans still say they prefer democracy to any other form of government. They reject military rule. They reject one-party states. They want to choose their leaders through free elections. So, what explains this contradiction? How did we arrive at a moment where Africans cheer the overthrow of elected governments? Where democracy exists on paper but dies in practice? Where the promise of the 1990s has given way to the despair of the 2020s? Well, to understand why democracy is failing in Africa, we need to go back to when it first seemed possible. The year is 1990. The Berlin Wall has just fallen. The Soviet Union is collapsing, and across Africa, something remarkable is happening. After decades of military dictatorship and one-party rule, a wave of popular uprising is forcing authoritarian leaders from power. In Benin, massive street protests topple President Matthew Kereko's Marxist regime. The country holds a national conference, drafts a new constitution, and elects a new president, all within months. Zambia follows, then Mali, then dozens more. The transformation appears total. By the mid-1990s, most African countries have adopted multi-party constitutions. They have enshrined term limits, typically 2 5-year terms, into law. Presidential elections become competitive. Opposition parties form openly. Independent newspapers launch. The era of the big man dictator seems to be ending. In 1994, Nelson Mandela's election in South Africa becomes the symbol of this democratic awakening. Millions of South Africans, black citizens, voting for the very first time. They stand in line stretching for hours. When Mandela raises his fist in victory, it feels like vindication. Democracy isn't just for the West, it's Africa's future too. The numbers bear this out. In the decade before 2021, coup attempts had become far less frequent in Africa. This represents a dramatic decline from the turbulent 1970s and 1980s when military takeovers were routine. Civil society organizations flourished. Independent judiciaries begin to assert themselves. Some countries, Botswana, Ghana, Mauritius, established genuine democratic traditions. But beneath the surface, cracks are forming. Uganda 2005. President Yoweri Museveni, in power since 1986, faces a constitutional roadblock. The law limits presidents to 2 terms. Museveni has served his 2. He should step down. But instead, he orchestrates a referendum to remove term limits entirely. The parliament, dominated by his party, approves this. Museveni runs again and again and again. Rwanda 2015, President Paul Kagame holds a referendum to reset term counts. The vote, conducted under tight government control, passes with overwhelming margins. Kagame, who has effectively ruled since 1994, secures yet another decade in power. In 2024, he wins a 4th term with 99% of the vote. This becomes the pattern. Leaders learn they don't need tanks to subvert democracy. They can now do it legally. Constitutional amendments, court rulings, referendums held under conditions where no is not really an option. Democracy becomes a shell. Elections held, parliaments convened, constitutions cited, but power never truly changes hands. By the 2010s, warning signs multiply. Benin, once hailed as a democratic success story, sees President Patrice Talon ban opposition parties before the 2019 elections. Tanzania's government under President John Magufuli jails opposition leaders and shut down newspapers. Zimbabwe's ruling party, ZANU-PF, has never lost a national election since independence in 1980. Not because of popularity, but because of systematic rigging and intimidation. The statistics become damning. Between 2011 and 2024, support for democracy drops 29 percentage points in South Africa. It falls 23 points in Mali, 18 points in Tunisia, 17 points in Burkina Faso. These aren't just numbers, they represent millions of people losing faith in the system. By 2020, Africa's democratic experiment is in crisis. And then, the coups began.
34-year-old Ibrahim Traoré is the new self-declared leader of Burkina Faso.
We are dissolving the Sovereign Council and removing the state's governors.
It began in Mali, August 2020. President Ibrahim Boubacar Keïta is arrested by his own military. The coup leaders accuse him of corruption, economic mismanagement, and the failure to stop a brutal jihadist insurgency that has consumed the country's north. They promise to restore stability. The international community, as always, condemns the takeover. The African Union suspends Mali's membership. ECOWAS, West Africa's regional bloc, imposes sanctions. But inside Mali, the reaction is quite different. Surveys show overwhelming support for the coup. In fact, one Afrobarometer study found over 80% of Malians saying the army is justified in intervening when leaders abuse power. The question is, why? Well, the answer lies in what democracy delivered, or rather, what it failed to deliver. You see, under Keïta, corruption was endemic. Government positions were sold to the highest bidder. Security forces, supposedly fighting jihadists, instead terrorized civilians in rural areas. Many young Malians were unable to find stable formal work, and in the north, entire regions fell under the control of armed groups linked to Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State. Democracy, in the eyes of many Malians, had become a cover for elite theft and incompetence. The same political class rotated positions, enriching themselves while the nation collapsed. So, when the military staged a coup, framing it as a patriotic intervention to save Mali, people believed them. And then Guinea follows months later. Special Forces Commander Colonel Mamadi Doumbouya overthrows President Alpha Condé, who had violated his term limits to seek a 3rd term. Doumbouya's justification echoes Mali's poverty and endemic corruption. Crowds in Conakry celebrate. And then Burkina Faso in January 2022, Lieutenant Colonel Paul-Henri Damiba ousted President Roch-Marc Christian Kabore, citing the government's inability to contain a spreading jihadist insurgency. Large, mostly youthful crowds rally in support, chanting, quote, "This is what we want." 9 months later, Damiba himself is overthrown by Captain Ibrahim Traoré, who accuses Damiba of the same failures. Then Niger in July 2023, presidential guards suddenly detained President Mohamed Bazoum, one of West Africa's last democratically elected leaders. The coup leaders claim deteriorating security and bad governance as justification for this coup. ECOWAS threatens military intervention. The soldiers refused to back down. Niger had been a Western counter-terrorism partner. Now, it pivots toward Russia. A pattern emerges. These coups aren't random. Officers in one country watch events in another, learning tactics and rhetoric. After Mali expelled French forces and invited Russian mercenaries, its neighbors took note. The leaders coordinate, forming a mutual defense pact. When ECOWAS threatens intervention, Mali and Burkina Faso pledged to defend Niger. They present themselves not as power-hungry militaries, but as a united front against neo-colonialism. The narrative becomes the military is reclaiming sovereignty from corrupt puppets of the West. And it works. Support for military intervention has flipped. Where about 70% of Malians used to oppose army rule, roughly 80% are now in favor. The shift is staggering because it reflects the reality of the common people. ECOWAS, once effective at defending democracy in the 1990s and 2000s, finds its leverage gone. Sanctions fail, mediation stalls, the coup belt solidifies. And while West Africa sees tanks rolling, East Africa's democratic decline is quieter, but no less complete. Uganda, President Yoweri Museveni, is now 81 years old. He has ruled for 39 years. He's preparing to run for a 7th term in 2026. The opposition barely exists as a political force. Its leaders are in jail or under constant surveillance. No one is allowed to challenge Museveni. The playbook is methodical. First, amend the constitution to remove term limits, done in 2005. Then remove age limits, done in 2017. Co-opt the Electoral Commission, control the judiciary, fuse the ruling party with the security apparatus. Use treason charges to neutralize threats. Label critics as terrorists or foreign agents, deploy surveillance and violence selectively. Enough to terrify, but never enough to trigger international action. This is Uganda's model, and it is replicated across the region. Rwanda's Kagame has ruled since 1994, initially as the power behind the presidency, then as president himself since 2000. His 2024 re-election with 99% of the vote is theater. Rwanda's parliament includes opposition parties in name, but they exist only with Kagame's permission. Independent candidates who might pose a genuine threat are barred from ballots, jailed, or disappear completely. The ruling RPF party controls every level of power. Tanzania, once hailed as liberalizing under President Samia Suluhu Hassan, has reverted to authoritarianism. After her predecessor John Magufuli's death in 2021, Samia released some political prisoners and promised reforms. In fact, civil society cautiously hoped. But by late 2023, opposition leader Tundu Lissu was detained again for demanding fair electoral conditions. Promised constitutional reforms were frozen. The ruling party, which has been in power since the 1970s, made clear it will not relinquish control. Well, if it's not broken, don't fix it. And then we have Sudan's trajectory, which is even darker. After 30 years under dictator Omar al-Bashir, mass protests forced him from power in April 2019. Sudan established a transitional civilian military government with a roadmap to elections. And for a brief moment, hope existed. Then, in October 2021, the military staged a coup, betraying the revolution. General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan dissolved the civilian government. Protesters returned to the streets. Security forces killed them, dozens of them. The international community, as usual, condemned the coup, but did so little to help. By April 2023, Sudan descended into civil war between rival military factions. The very generals who claimed to protect Sudan are now tearing it apart.
First of all, we are declaring a state of emergency. Second, we are dissolving the Sovereign Council and removing the state governors.
Central Africa is where democracy never truly arrived. Here, aging autocrats have ruled for decades, building systems designed to ensure they die in office. Cameroon's Paul Biya, aged 92, has been president since 1982. Equatorial Guinea's Teodoro Obiang Nguema, age 83, seized power in a 1979 coup. Republic of Congo's Denis Sassou Nguesso, age 82, has ruled for more than 4 decades across different periods. These are not presidents. They are monarchs in all but name. And their strategy is coup-proofing, building patronage networks so deeply established that challenging them becomes impossible. They shuffle military commanders constantly, preventing any single general from accumulating too much power. They co-opt business elites, distributing oil wells to loyalists. They eliminate opposition not just politically, but existentially through exile, imprisonment, or assassinations. Elections are held, yes, but these are just formalities. Biya wins with 70%, Obiang with 90%, Sassou with 88%. Opposition parties exist on paper but are systematically marginalized. Independent media is crushed. Civil society organizations are infiltrated or banned completely. And the result is surface stability masking deep fragility. These autocrats understand that their systems depend on one man. There is no institutionalized succession. When they die, the entire structure could collapse into violence. Already, Central African Republic's president has abolished term limits, preparing to rule for life. Congo's Sassou is reportedly maneuvering to position his son. Cameroon's elite jockeys for position in anticipation of Biya's eventual exit. The danger is that when these dinosaurs finally fall, through death or coup, the resulting power vacuums could trigger civil wars. Which means Central Africa's regimes aren't strong, they are brittle. And now the question is why? Why has democracy failed so much across Africa? The answer is complex. A web of interconnected forces. But 7 factors stand out for us. First is weak institutions. Democracy requires checks and balances. But in many African states, institutions bend to the will of strong men. Courts are packed with loyalists. Electoral commissions serve ruling parties. Parliaments rubber-stamp constitutional amendments. When institutions are hollow, democracy becomes theater. And the second is corruption and poor governance. Democracy promised better lives, but in country after country, elected leaders enriched themselves while citizens suffered. Public funds vanished, services collapsed, rule of law evaporated. And when democracy delivers only ballots but not development, people lose faith. Currently, only 37% of Africans are satisfied with how democracy works. And thirdly, we have economic desperation. High unemployment, debt crisis, inflation, inequality. When governments fail to put food on tables, democracy's legitimacy suffers. Authoritarian leaders promise development without the messiness of pluralism. Some citizens, especially youth, become willing to trade perceived freedom for stability. And then fourthly, we have security threats. Jihadist insurgencies in the Sahel, civil wars in Sudan and Ethiopia, and we have terrorism in Somalia. Security crises provide justification for crackdowns and military rule. Governments declare emergencies, suspend rights, postpone elections, all in the name of security. And militaries, they position themselves as saviors, claiming civilians failed. The fifth point here is external actors. China and Russia support authoritarian regimes with no strings attached, no demands for democratic reform, and they offer developmental opportunities. Meanwhile, Western nations often prioritize counterterrorism and migration control over democracy itself, cooperating with autocrats when convenient for them. This geopolitical permissiveness enables backsliding. While Western nations swear democracy is the best thing after sliced bread, they turn around to enable strongmen who continue to kill democratic institutions in Africa. So, what is the difference? And the sixth point for us is the big man syndrome. Many Africans treat the presidency as personal property. They cultivate personality cults, present themselves as irreplaceable father figures, and they refuse to leave office once their term is off. This legacy, part post-colonial, part opportunistic, is hard to break. Leaders amend constitutions, rig elections, and justify their endless rule as necessary for stability. The seventh point is public indecisiveness. 2/3 of Africans prefer democracy in principle, but 53% say they would tolerate a military coup to stop leaders who abuse power. So what do you want? This dangerous ambivalence reflects deep frustration. People want democracy, but if it doesn't work, they are open to alternatives, even anti-democratic ones. These forces feed each other. Weak institutions enable corruption. Corruption causes economic failure. Economic failure fuels instability. Instability invites military intervention. Military intervention weakens institutions further. The cycle repeats. Across Africa, 3 competing stories are told about democracy's failure. The military leaders and autocrats say, "We saved you." They claim they intervened to end corruption, restore order, and defend sovereignty. They call themselves patriots, not dictators. And some of that is true. Mali's coup leaders did in fact liberate the country from French neocolonialism, same as Burkina Faso's Traoré. But the same cannot be said of Egypt's Sisi, who says his crackdown stopped terrorism and chaos. Rwanda's Kagame says his system brought stability after genocide. This narrative resonates with citizens exhausted by dysfunction. But the freedom he fought for is now being eroded by his own actions. The opposition and activists say military intervention is power grab. They call coups what they are, betrayals of democracy. They document abuses, demand accountability, and refuse to legitimize illegitimate regimes. And ordinary citizens say, "We want democracy, but make it work." They still prefer democratic principles. 66% do, but their patience is exhausted. They have voted in election after election without seeing change. They have watched leaders promise reform, then loot the state. So when soldiers appear, some cheer, not because they love military rule, but because anything feels better than the status quo. These competing narratives matter because the battle for Africa's democratic future isn't just political, it's rhetorical. Whoever controls the story controls legitimacy. But then that raises one question for me. Must Africa practice democracy though? If it is not working, why stick with it? You see, democracy in Africa stands at a crossroad. One path leads to continued decline. More coups, more stolen elections, more aging autocrats clinging to power until death. That path ends in instability because systems built on repression are brittle. When strong men fall, the resulting power vacuums can trigger civil wars. Well, there's another path, which is democratic renewal. It is harder. It requires leaders who respect term limits and leave office with grace. It requires institutions strong enough to check executive power. It requires governance that delivers, so that democracy earns continued public support. It requires regional bodies that consistently oppose not just military coups, but constitutional manipulations. You cannot criticize military coup when at the same time supporting stolen elections. And this will also require international partners who support democratic forces rather than propping up dictators for strategic convenience. This path is possible. Ghana has sustained it across multiple peaceful transfers of power, but time is running out. Africa's median age is 19. An entire generation has watched democracy promise change, yet deliver disappointment. They have seen leaders amend constitutions to stay forever. They have seen elections rigged. They have seen corrupt officials go unpunished. They have seen opposition leaders jailed for demanding fairness. Some of them wave Russian flags when soldiers seize power. Not because they understand the geopolitics behind this, but because they are desperate for anything different. The question isn't whether Africans want democracy. I want to believe many still do. Surveys prove it. The question now is whether democracy can deliver before patience runs out completely.